All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in today for our Chemistry Education Group seminar. We are thrilled to be welcoming Pavan Kadandale here today with us this afternoon. To start, we were going to have you answer a quick poll everywhere poll to see how you heard about our talk. I think with our introductions, we have a pretty good sense of where that may have been. So I think we can skip that. And before I introduce our speaker, I want to acknowledge, as the University of Washington and the attendees from other institutions, the Coast Salish peoples of this land, which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Our speaker today, as I said, is Professor Pavan Kadandale, and he completed his undergraduate degree in India at Bangalore University, and then went on to earn a master's degree in India before studying cell and developmental biology at Rutgers University. He's now part of the faculty at UC Irvine, and he works on biology education research that focuses on projects promoting and measuring critical thinking skills amongst his students. He's telling us today about some excellent collaborative work and active learning that he's been bringing into his courses. And we are always interested in hearing better ways to teach and better ways to make sure our assessments are truly assessing our student competencies around their course objectives. And so we're really excited to hear all that you have to share with us. So I will turn things over to you.
Awesome. Thank you guys for the invite. Thank you, Colleen, for the invite. Thank you, Amgad, for all of the coordination work. It's always it just makes life so much easier when someone coordinates everything, and I'm deeply appreciative and grateful for all of that. And thank you everyone for coming, and hopefully we'll have a fun exchange of ideas. And I want to spark off the exchange by sort of talking a little bit about the work I've been doing, trying to get more collaboration and group work into the classrooms, into the classes that I teach. Sort of a big driving force for this has been that previous work has shown that group work is generally good for students. And also, I assume you have sort of the same problem or experience at UW, is our bio students come in with this incredibly competitive mindset. They think that anyone else, not only do they have to get an A, but if anybody else gets an A, then they're not going to get into med school because the other person's going into med school. And so we've had a lot of issues with this, and so the idea is to sort of change the culture as well within the bio major. What do we know? What is the problem we're trying to address, and what do we know so far? So large universities, as we know, students are coming from much smaller places like their high schools, where they get much more individualized attention by and large, into this large university setting where they're suddenly sitting there, an anonymous face in a class of 500 students, and it's sometimes they don't even know the professor's name, like forget knowing their colleagues' names. I've literally had students have long conversations with me without realizing that I was the professor who taught them biochemistry that they've just been saying they hated for the last 20 minutes. But and then it's like, well, clearly you didn't come to class. So anyway, so there's this experience of this large anonymous teaching that happens in our large classes. And for many, many different reasons, this is obviously not an ideal situation, neither for the students and obviously not for us as faculty, because I have never heard a single faculty member say, oh, I love those large classes and the anonymity that it brings to me. But one of the issues is that these large classes particularly affect minoritized students, first-gen students, students from low-income backgrounds, and female students, because the large anonymous format tends to further deepen problems that already exist for these communities of students. And so in the end, what happens is we get these so-called achievement gaps for a lot of these groups of students. We see differential performance in our exams, and then ultimately we see differential retention in our majors, differential representation in career pathways. And so there's this cascading effect that happens. And so the idea then is there some way to get rid of some of these effects, or at least minimize some of these effects? And obviously shrinking our classrooms or our students is not really the solution. We're not going to get much traction. We're still going to have these large classes. And so what are some of the things we can practically implement in order to sort of at least reduce the feeling of the anonymity and kind of get rid of some of these effects. So that's kind of the driving force. And a lot of people have obviously approached this problem. This is not unique in any form or fashion or new. And so people have been incorporating small group activities in large classes. Most of the time, they tend to be activity-based, and I'm sure all of you have some form of small groups happening in your classes. And generally speaking, the research shows that having these small groups ends up having positive effects in many different instances and cases. And when we think about these small groups that we create in our classes, there's lots of variables we grapple with. What's the ideal group size? How do we form the groups? Are we basing the groups on demographics, on ethnicity, on gender? What are the kinds of activities we're going to make them do within the group that's going to make the group effective or not effective? And then what is the incentive system that we provide for students to work in groups, right? So there's a huge number of variables. And I want to point you to a great resource at CBE LSE that was published a couple of years ago, where they take a lot of these variables and they put them into this nice little node, into this tree diagram, which has all these nodes. And if you go and you click on a node, it's actually going to pull up what's generally known about that particular node and what some of the evidence that supports the overall conclusions that you see in this node. So if you go to task structure, for example, and click on task structure, it will tell you that by and large, if you have complex tasks, that's much better to get groups to work and work together. And it's much more effective than having groups work on simple tasks. And then it will give you some of the literature telling you why that is so, or what we know about that evidence. So it's a great resource, and there's quite a bit of pre-existing work that has already been done in this domain. And when we think about sort of the group work activities that most of us incorporate in our classes, they tend to fall on two ends, right? So there's usually, most commonly, what we use are sort of temporary in-class group activities, right? So we do active learning. We say, turn to the people around you, solve a problem, discuss a clicker question, something of that sort, think, pair, share, something like that. On the other end of the spectrum would be like much more task-based groups, right? So we might say, okay, this group is going to work on a presentation that you're going to give at the end of the quarter, and then you're going to be graded on that presentation, something like that, right? And of course, these are two extremes, and it's really a continuum. So you might have things in between, like there are cases where a final grade of a student is based on both the individual performance as well as the performance of a group that a student may be in. So it's kind of a combination grade. There's some literature on that this kind of exams might be effective. Another example of sort of this continuum might be what we're doing in lab courses, that a group of 4 students might work on experiments together, but then they submit independent lab reports so that if their group screwed up the experiment, it wasn't their fault, they kind of don't get penalized because they still managed to submit an independent lab report. So kind of a pretty broad spectrum of things that are going on. And generally speaking, temporary groups are advantageous because they're pretty easy to implement. There's no administrative overhead. You're literally just saying, turn to each other, form a Zoom breakout room, whatever that is, pretty easy. There's usually there's no direct incentive for working in the group. And although they've been proven to be effective, most of the literature doesn't clearly differentiate between sort of the effect of the group versus the effect of the overall class structure, which usually incorporates a lot more active learning. So we don't know if the overall effect is because of the actual group, the formation of the groups, or the overall class structure. It's pretty hard to disambiguate those two effects. There's also no intentionality when we have these temporary groups for students to form an actual learning community, right? They see each other in class. In the next class, if they're sitting at a different place, they're going to be talking to a different person. They don't really care. They're not forming any kind of community. They're not forming any kind of relationships with the students or any kinds of bonds. And so we might be missing an opportunity to further improve learning outcomes for students, because we know that having a sense of community can actually improve learning outcomes for a lot of these groups of students that traditionally show these achievement gaps. On the other hand, if we look at task-based groups, they're obviously good because students are forced to work together outside of class time because they have to accomplish some kind of task, right? And their grade depends on this task, so they have to get it done. Anybody, however, who has used task-based groups has run into the problems of students always complaining that their performance was now being determined by factors beyond their control, right? The grade is unfair because I have never met a student group where every student didn't do all the work and every other student didn't write their code kits, right? It's amazing. It's like this magic group that always gets formed. So there's always this sort of push and pull about the perceived fairness or unfairness of the grade that they ultimately get when you have these task-based groups. And then in general, whichever kind of groups we form, there's a fair amount of literature that shows that there might be detrimental effects on certain marginalized student populations. So the classic example is LGBTQ plus students traditionally end up doing worse when they're forced to be in a group for various reasons, because they don't feel comfortable, all sorts of bad things happen, and sort of they don't perform as well. The other thing that's been shown is that if we just tell students to form study groups and we don't have explicit connection between those study groups and activities that we make them do in class, those study groups are utterly and completely useless, right? So if we're having students form groups or communities, there has to be explicit connections with what's happening in class. And depending again upon the category of students, when students are forced into doing groups, some of them can end up getting pretty anxious, and that anxiety can manifest itself disproportionately in different sets of students, and again, exacerbate the problem instead of actually helping make it better. Right, so these are some of the issues with group work, whether it's those temporary groups or whether it's sort of stronger task-based groups. There are some disadvantages. So I was thinking that in an ideal world, you would try to get the best of both worlds, right? That we would have small groups where students worked collaboratively, but this collaboration would have some incentive. That collaborative work would be incentivized. So students have some reason to actually try to work together. But you can't have group projects because then you run into this issue of, oh, my grade was unfair. So the incentive can't purely be based on the group work, right? And you want them to form communities and relationships so they're working throughout the quarter, not just on one specific task or activity. So again, if you have a task-based group, they're only working together, let's say, to complete the experiment, but they're not really helping each other out throughout the quarter, right? They're not forming a community of learners, which would be super awesome to have. And then, because you don't want to run the risk of forcing students into groups when it would actually be detrimental, you want to allow students the choice of whether they want to work in a group and whether it would be beneficial to them. And then obviously, of course, just like most of you, I have a pretty large teaching load. So anything that increases my administrative load, I'm like, this is not going to work, right? Whatever system I come up with has to be very, very administratively simple. You cannot have, you do not want to be dealing with students for 10 weeks going, my group sucks, put me in a different group, or this teammate said this and now my grade is affected. I have 600 students, and if I have 100 groups, there's no way I want to deal with that kind of administrative overhead, right? So something that's administratively simple, and obviously at the end of it all, I want to see some real effects, that it actually helps students learn better and have a better experience. And ideally, I want to start seeing some of these achievement gaps get narrowed once I have this intervention. So this was sort of the driving motivation, the driving force behind the design, and sort of the design principles for what I came up with. And so in order to come up with an incentive system, I turned to some things that we knew about behavioral economics, which basically posits that human beings are but largely irrational creatures, right? We're not these people that are sitting down saying, what is the most logical course of action? And that's what I'm going to do. We react, we take these emotional decisions. So you can tell students up and down the wazoo, form a learning community. It is good for you in the long run. And that is going to do nothing because that's not how we work, right? So based on all of this, we had some ideas that you have to have incentives that are put in place that are both short-term and long-term. Students need to be able to see the immediate effects of working in a group. and also have some kind of long-term effect in order for this whole thing to actually come together and prove to be pretty effective. So that's another one of the design principles that we paid attention to. So based on all of this, this was kind of the collaborative class structure that we came up with. So we have students fill out a survey at the beginning of the quarter saying that they want to be part of a learning community. Part of the survey is making it explicit. So one of the other things we realize is that a lot of us tell students, oh, working in groups is great, like form groups, form learning communities, teamwork is awesome, yay. But we never tell them what that means. What is a good group? How do you belong to a good group? If you're put together with a bunch of 5 people, how do you make that into an effective team? What does it take to be a good team, right? We don't ever give them instruction on that. So once part of the survey is actually making explicit what the expectations are. So the survey has about 10 questions, and the questions will say things like, I may think I'm the strongest person in the group and everybody else is not as good as me or contributing as much as me. Will you still continue working in the group, right? It might be, oh, my schedule changed and now I don't have as much free time, but I've made a commitment to the group, so I'm going to continue working in the group. So questions like that sort of force them to think about, what is this commitment I'm making when I say I want to be part of a group, right? So then you have all of the students that, at least in theory, are sort of making the same level of commitment to wanting to be in a community or a study group. Does that make sense? And for the sake of time, I'm not going through all the questions, but later on, if anyone wants, I'm happy to share the survey, happy to send the questions out. You know, whatever resources you feel might be helpful, I'm happy to provide at the end. The one other question we ask in the survey is for their cumulative GPAs so far. And the reason is because we then take that information and create groups that are now all academically equal, at least based on their cumulative GPA. So the average GPA of every group in the class is statistically identical. So there's no strong group or weak group. They're all, at least academically, in theory, they should be pretty equal, right? So no one's starting off at an advantage. That makes sense? So based on this, what's the long-term incentive that we provide for students to work in a group? So the long-term incentive is we take the score that they finally get. All exams, by the way, in the class are all independently done. So there's no group work at all in the class. Nothing is submitted as a group. Everything is done independently. So the long-term incentive is that at the end of the class, I can take the grades that each student got in the class and convert it to a GPA for this class, for my class, right? And I can compare the group's average grade with their incoming, so their average GPA in the class versus the average incoming GPA that they had. And if they do better than expected, that means they've really helped each other out in the class and done something really good. And so they get a further bonus credit, which then gets factored into the calculation of their grade, right? So let's, just as a really quick example, let's say a student got a B-, but overall, their group did better than expected based on this comparison of class GPA versus cumulative GPA. So they get an additional bonus point, and that might bump them up to a B. Right? So that's the long-term incentive that they have. And that grade now is not dependent just on their work, but being able to help their entire group do better. Because if only they did better, you're not going to see that much of a change in the overall GPA of that group. Right? And simultaneously, along with this, there's a video I've created, again, which I'm happy to share, which talks about explicitly what are the things you have to do to create an effective team and what does the research say about it. So they're given a little bit of instruction on how they can create an effective team, what they should look out for. Okay, so great. Long-term incentives, which human beings are completely useless at. If you just gave people long-term incentives, we would get nothing done. By and large, I mean, there are exceptions, but most of us would do nothing, right? So we need short-term incentives. So the short-term incentive is going to be better performance in each of the midterms, and there are 3 midterms in the class. right? And so I had to change the structure of the midterms so that group work suddenly becomes really helpful for them to take their exams and do better in each individual exam. Okay. And Samantha says you've gamified the process. So sort of gamification, but it's not an explicit gamification. And then Lutz asks, how big is a typical group? So this was also really interesting. We did a few iterations of this where it didn't work. And it turns out the ideal group, at least for us, is about 5 or 6 students. And there's some weird psychology that happens behind this, right? So when we first started, I made groups of 4. And most students didn't actually work with their groups. And when I talked to them informally, it turned out that usually about 50% of the students would initially respond to wanting to meet up after class and work on something together, right? And 50% of 4 is 2. And they're like, it's just one other person, screw this, I'm not interested, like forget it. There's not, I don't know. But when it's 6 people, 50% of 6 is 3. So as long as there's 3, apparently then they'll all do it. So go figure. Anyway, so that was the lesson I learned after a few unsuccessful. So 5 to 6 students is some sort of quorum, psychological quorum that gets them to actually work together. Okay, any other questions before I go on and tell you about the change in the framework of the exam?
You assigned the groups, right? So yes. Okay. And then at the end of the term, the bonus points, is it, I mean, how do you know that they worked, I mean, does it matter if they worked with other people or if they only worked together? Or?
No, there's no way I can, because again, remember, the other thing I tell them, and thanks for bringing that up, Colleen, the other thing I tell them is once the groups are formed, I'm out of it. What they make with the group is up to them. And that's why there's the video on how to create an effective team. And I tell them that's how they're going to get the most out of being in a learning community or being in a learning team. And that's it. And they can't come to me and say their group sucks because all of the work is individually submitted. So if your group sucks, you still have to learn the material on your own. And you're still taking the exams on your own. So if your group sucks, that's fine. Just don't listen to them and do your work on your own, which is what you would have done in the class anyway. Right? So it's kind of this administratively, it's really nice to sort of wash my hands off of this after the initial work of creating the groups and giving them a little bit of instruction on how to make an effective team.
I don't know if I missed this, but how many of the students in the initial survey out of say 600 wanted to do this?
So out of the class, variable from year to year. So this year I have about 65% of the students wanted to be in groups.
Okay, because so since I teach at a community college, we have very small classes. So I'm trying to see how this could work. You know, you were saying the perfect group is 6 students, and that's when you have such a small class of students who want to participate, you get 2 groups. If 60% of your class, and all of a sudden you're with 2 groups, and I'm just.
No, that's a fair point. My thinking would be if you have a really small class, then a lot of the issues with normally forming groups go away because you can still give each group a lot more individualized and personalized attention. So if you have a small class, I might even say just make it compulsory, like just put them all in groups, right? Don't give them a choice. That would be my suggestion. And then another question was, how big is the boost they can get if their group does well? So the formula that I use for the incentive is so really quickly, they can get, basically the bump moves them up 1 fractional grade, by and large. That's what it'll equate to. So from a B- to a B, or B to a B+, B+ to an A-, that's generally the boost that they get. So not huge, but on the other hand, these are irrational pre-med students, so they'll take every chance. And it's all, like, to me, it's all about leveraging their irrationality. I can't change that, so I might as well, instead of using it for evil like a large corporation, I'm going to use it for good and hopefully help them learn better. Other questions before I go on? All right, cool. So the class structure and sort of how it's going to work. So again, really quickly, at the beginning of the quarter, the students are deciding if they want to be placed in groups. This is where the instructor effort comes into play. You have to release the survey. You have to put them into groups. But again, at this point of time now, I've got script. So as soon as the survey is done, I just throw the data in our script and it spits out groups and I'm good to go. And then I have the video recorded. So that's also pretty good to go. And then hopefully students between lectures are going to be working together. Within the lecture activities itself, they also work with group members, they're assigned groups. And I can do this because I also assigned seating when we were in person many decades ago. And then if we're doing this virtually, then the Zoom breakout rooms are pre-assigned to their learning communities. Okay, so there's continuity. When they go to discussion sections, the same learning communities go to the discussion section, so that group is maintained across every aspect of the class. And then finally, when they take their exams and during lectures, they're allowed some amount of collaboration. And again, I'll get to that in just a second. And so that way there's incentive for working together because they realize, oh, if we work together, we're going to do better on the exams. And so that's the short-term incentive as well. Okay, so what is this exam structure that we've developed that actually promotes, fosters student collaboration? So the way I do my exams now is the exam is broken down into 3 parts. So the first part, I send them out a pre-exam about a week before the actual midterm. The pre-exam consists of just data and no question, right? And the explanation for the data. So it might be, so I might say, here's a graph, and the light bars are showing, hospitalizations of patients due to vaccination who are unvaccinated, and dark gray bars show hospitalization of patients who are vaccinated, let's say, for example. That's it. That's all they get. No questions. Right. So this becomes a very complex task for them because now they got to figure out what am I possibly going to ask them based on this data. Right. And they realize as we go through the class, hopefully, that you can connect a lot of different concepts together. So for example, I can show them data that's a protein gel, but ask them questions that have to do with what kinds of amino acid interactions might be causing this data to show up the way it did. Right. So it's not going to be obvious questions like just interpretation of data, but really analysis and stuff. So this is the incentive for them. So now they're going to come up with a lot more questions and figure out a lot more possibilities if they're collaborating together. On the day of the exam itself is now broken down into 2 parts. The first part is about 2/3 of the exam time. So I have a 15-minute period, and about 25 minutes is the first part. In the first part, they're given the same data and questions that are now in the free response format. So they've worked on the data. There's nothing new. They've had a week to digest the data and go through it and collaborate. And during the first phase of the exam, they're allowed to collaborate with their learning communities or groups. So again, the incentive is, oh, I can't figure it out, but if we all work together, then other people are going to share answers. We're all going to do well together. Right? And then finally, they get the same questions in the final third, which is about 15 minutes for my class. They get 2 kinds of questions. They get either most of the questions they've already seen in phase 1. It's the exact same question, but now they'll have multiple choice answers. And this is the only part that's going to get graded. So the theory is if they didn't figure out the answers here, in 15 minutes, it's going to be very hard for them to figure it out here. Because these are usually complex questions and complex answers. Right? So these questions then can measure the learning of students. However, we don't know if they do well in this part of the exam. It could just be that they got all the answers without really understanding it too well from their from other students in the learning community that actually figured it out. So there's a subset of questions in the second part of the exam, which the students have never seen before. And I tell them that this is going to happen. Most of them they would have seen before, but a few questions will be completely new. So they've not had a chance to discuss these questions at all. So looking at their performance on these questions tells me whether they're actually independently also improving, or are they just sort of riding the coattails of their learning community. Make sense? So in the future, I'll call these sort of the independent questions, and then these will just be the regular midterm scores. So by looking at the midterm scores and the independent question scores, I can differentiate whether it's just everybody doing better because they're copying answers off of each other, or are they actually learning the material better. Okay, so we looked at the data, and so that's the short-term incentive. So we've built the whole class structure out. We have short-term and long-term incentives. All of this is good. So is this having any effect? So when we looked at just the midterm performance, again, if any of this is effective, we would predict that students who are in this. And CLC is, so the term I call them is sort of class-based learning communities. Do these students who opted to be in class-based learning communities perform better than their non-CLC counterparts? And the answer is yes, they do. Similarly, if we look at the independent question scores, so they've never seen these questions, they've never had a chance to discuss them with anyone, so it's got to be a measure of their own learning in the class. Again, same question, do the CLC students do better than the non-CLC students? And again, the answer is yes, they do. The problem with just looking at the boxes is we don't know whether there's any kinds of differential exams in differential effects due to demographic differences. So we looked also at regression analyses. We did some GLM models to make sure that even after we disaggregated the data, we would still see these effects. And Samantha's question is, are these the only types of exams in the course? And do students know the exam structure when they decline to work in groups? So Samantha, yes, these are the only types of summative assessments in the course. There are formative, like pre-lecture quizzes that they take, which only counts for completion. And students know the exam structure. It's posted on the first day of class, so they're well aware of what the exams are going to look like before they make their decision on whether they want to join a CLC or not. And then Ensley asked whether I allow for non-CLC students to change their mind and form a group mid-quarter. As of now, the answer is no, because remember, I'm trying to make academically equivalent groups. So if somebody wants to join later, there's no way for me to be able to put them in a group now that then is going to maintain the academic equivalency across all groups. So, so as of now, the answer is no. But if there are better ways to form groups, then maybe the answer could be yes. But as of now, no. Okay, so if we look at the regression analysis, and I'm just showing you the coefficients just plotted here, so it's easy to visualize. And we see that the students who opt to be in a CLC overall on the midterms do significantly better. We're still seeing some issues. We're still seeing some achievement gaps for minoritized students, and we're seeing some gender gaps for female students. I have theories about why we're seeing this, but I have no idea why they persist and how we get rid of them. But that's another conversation. So we also wanted to look whether this difference in the CLC was due to people just getting answers or because of the independent question scores as well. And we see that even in the independent question scores, when we run the regression analyses, we see the exact same trend, which is students who are part of a learning community end up doing significantly better than their counterparts who are not part of the learning community. Okay. We then wanted to check, this was the big question for me, whether we're actually being able to narrow some of these achievement gaps that we've been seeing. So we ran the regression analyses, but now accounting for interaction terms to see whether being in a group interacted with minoritized status or gender status or any of the other demographic differences that we were looking for. And so we found two variables that interacted significantly with being in a class learning community. The first was minoritized status. And we see here that the CLCs narrow the achievement gaps for students who are from minoritized backgrounds. And very quickly, again, what's happening here is in order to know the effect of a class learning community, because we have an interaction term, we have to combine both the effect of just the CLC as well as the effect of the interaction to get the overall effect of the CLC for minoritized versus non-minoritized students, right? So if you're a non-minoritized students, this will become 0 because you're either minoritized or not, so it's a binary variable. And this term will then become 0. So you are only you're only going to get an advantage of about 0.6 points on the exam if you're in a learning community versus not in a learning community, normalizing for all of the other demographic differences. However, if you are a minoritized student, now the difference becomes 3.6 times 1 plus 0.6, which is a 4.2% improvement in your score if you're a minoritized student and in a learning community. Does that make sense? And we sort of see the same trend if we look at what's happening for minoritized students. They're on average doing worse by about 5.8 points. But if they're in the group or in a CLC, and then that term becomes 1, then that gap narrows to only about 2.2 points. So they're still doing worse, but we've narrowed the gap. That makes sense? And then the other term that interacted was prior achievement in terms of their GPA. And again, we saw that when you had students in CLCs, their prior performance became less important. It's still very, very predictive, but you're still narrowing the gap. So it's not just that students who are consistently doing well are doing well. And again, we know that GPA in their early careers is also very largely dependent on sort of their socioeconomic characteristics that they're coming with. And so being able to remove the effect of GPA actually is beneficial, because then it's saying what they're doing in this class matters more than what they've been doing in other classes, right? And we see the same effect. So that's kind of the main take-home messages that we have. So being in these CLCs with this particular class structure is beneficial, and it's helping narrowing down some of those achievement gaps. We're able to create these small groups where students work collaboratively throughout the quarter. We've designed this incentive system where there are no group projects, but students still see the clear incentive in helping each other out throughout the quarter. And we've managed to do this in a way that's relatively very, very low touch as far as an instructor is concerned. So you don't have a lot of additional work that you have to do. And there's not really a huge change that you have to do in terms of your class structure. So if you're doing active learning, you're still continuing to do active learning. Nothing about that is changing. You might have to change your exams a little bit in order to give them the incentive to work together. But other than that, I don't think it's very hard to do. And we see that making these changes is actually beneficial to our students and helps narrow down some of the achievement gaps that we're seeing. Okay, Rachel's question was, were the score gaps you saw comparing minoritized to non-minoritized students on exams in this group format the same magnitude for previous exam formats? There's an exam where students work together with nearby students they don't know, disadvantage minoritized students. So Rachel, yes, the answer to your question is yes. And the reason is because when the first part of the exam happens during those 25 minutes when they're allowed to discuss with their learning communities, the students who opted to not be in learning communities are still free to discuss their answers with anybody else around them, and they do. So it's not that they have no ability to discuss, but the fact that they haven't formed these communities is not giving them that benefit or that advantage that we're seeing in the CLC group. Did I understand your question correctly?
Yeah,
Rachel?
I guess I would say, I guess I was more asking, like, if you compare this kind of group collaboration exam format to a more traditional, like, single individual exam, and you look at like the magnitude of the gaps that you're seeing between minoritized and non-minoritized students, are the minoritized students when they're kind of shifting to these exam formats where they have to work with others
Oh,
that don't
I
already
see.
know the group, are they now being more disadvantaged, or is this kind of something that
Yeah,
reflects what you would normally see?
right. There's no way to do that analysis because there's so many other variables that come into the picture in doing that kind of analysis. So the class structure is different, the exam format is different, the way the questions are structured is different. So it's very hard for me to disambiguate looking at previous exams whether the gap was different or not.
All
Does
right,
that
got it.
make
Yeah,
sense?
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I have no good way of answering your question. So a few things to remember though is all of this data. So the students self-selected into whether they wanted to be in groups or not, right? So there might be some kind of selection bias effects that we're seeing. Hard for me to rule those out. I think it seems pretty unlikely because such a large fraction of the students are actually choosing to be in the learning community. And so what would be, just because they want to be in a learning community, they're doing better in class seems a little weird to me, but again, I can't rule that out. The other thing we notice is if we look at how each group performed. So I had whatever 50 groups, and looking at their median exam performance for each group, you see that there's quite a few groups that do worse than the non-CLC students. The majority of groups do better than significantly better, but there's individual group differences, right? And there's one group that actually ended up doing worse. So the effect is not evenly distributed. And as of now, we don't know why, right? So this is again something that I think there's a lot of room for improvement. So I think we could try different methods of grouping students. Maybe we group them based on student demographics as opposed to just GPA. But if we do that, then would we have to have different incentive structures in order to get them to continue collaborating effectively throughout the quarter? And then I really want to get into this notion of why did some teams work really well and see this really strong effect, and we didn't see it in other teams? What differentiated those teams? So that's something we're very interested in following up. And someday when we're not getting whiplash from pivoting to remote teaching to in-person teaching to no remote teaching for 2 weeks to no in-person teaching for 4 weeks, when my whiplash calms down, I think that's something we definitely want to examine more. We'll probably have to do a lot more qualitative work and kind of follow exactly what students are doing to figure that out. And so ideally, then the whole goal is if more and more people incorporate this, that I really want to see a change in the culture where we're moving away from this very, very competitive culture of pre-med students to something that's much more collaborative, which I think is much better for all the students in the long run. So I want to leave with sort of this positive message that there is a way for us to take these large classes that we are forced to teach in and kind of have a much more small class experience. Not perfectly, but I think we can recapitulate some of that. And then as I answer some of the questions, I'm going to leave you with some student quotes. These are student quotes that came out of my end of the quarter evaluations. The question was just generally about the class, not specifically about whether group work was effective. So the fact that so many of them, these are just an example, but many of them commented on the group aspect of the class, which I thought was very, very satisfying and shows that even in terms of student experience, it's having a pretty beneficial effect. Yeah, so Lutz had a great question. Do you know why students initially chose to join or not join a CLC, and whether in hindsight that they chose the other way? And I've heard students anecdotally say both things. And again, I think this is a great question and something we want to follow up on and see, what might be driving student decisions to be part of a CLC or not, and vice versa. And then Amjad said, do groups have any check-ins with the instructor throughout the semester? And that's exactly the point. The answer is no, because I don't want to deal with that. There's enough other stuff that I have to deal with that anything I do has to be low touch, right? So So it's made very clear that it's up to them how they deal with the groups. At most, I might have some students come into student hours or office hours and say, hey, my group isn't participating. Do you have any advice? And then we might have a discussion of how to make a more effective team. But other than that, no, I don't have them check in with me. The only other thing is I have them do a weekly reflection at the end of every week with a bunch of questions about what did you do this week? Like, did you read the textbook? Did you come up with questions? One of the questions is, did you engage with your group actively or not? So they just answer that. It's self-reported. I don't check whether they actually did or didn't do anything. The other thing I want to be very clear on, and I didn't make this clear, is there's no penalty to the group. So if the group did worse than expected, no one's grade goes down. So, so there's only a positive benefit that they would have. And okay, I think I got through all of the questions. If I missed anyone's question, I apologize. Just go ahead and put it in chat again, and I'm happy to get to it.
Rather than typing, I might just throw my tag on question out there about the groups having check-ins, and I'm with these weekly reflections. I'm wondering if you've looked at all if the correlation of how well the group did correlates to self-reported data on how frequently they met with their group.
So we've done this in a prior iteration, and in that iteration, we did not see a correlation with how frequently the groups met and how well they did. The problem is that that kind of survey is a little too broad, I think, to get at that question, because it's unclear to me what is. So let's say, for example, they had a Discord group and somebody made one comment on the Discord group that week, and I read the comment. That counts as, oh, we met during the week, right? So I think to really get at those questions, Samantha, I think we have to do some student interviews and dig poke a little bit more about what went on.
Yeah, for sure.
So I see you posted some nice comments from students. Did you have any complaints about the structure?
Actually, surprisingly not. Nobody complained.
So did that group that did extremely poor, do you anticipate there being sort of similar to what you were talking about at the beginning of the talk, in that my group didn't, my group was terrible and I should have gotten this boost because, I was put in the wrong group kind of thing?
There might be, but I make an effort to tell them that ultimately, since everything is independently done, it still doesn't depend on their group, right? There's no component of the grade that's directly dependent on the group. There's also nothing that would have stopped them from forming an informal learning community, and still, they wouldn't have gotten the grade boost, but they would have still done better on the exams.
Right, that I was more meaning like
Right.
the grade boost, that's what I was
so
the grade boost in terms of, my group didn't do well, so I didn't get the grade boost.
Right, so surprisingly, and that this goes to Lutz's question about how many students got the positive grade boost at the end. It's variable quarter to quarter, but so far on average, about 4 to 5 groups actually end up getting the grade boost. So 20 to 30 students at the end of the class. So it's actually surprisingly not that many students, but it's very positively remarked upon by most students. And also, Lutz's question, do some students feel additional pressure to do well on exams so they don't let their group down? That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I think that's part of the follow-up that we want to do, which is poke a little bit more and see what students are going through when they're working in these groups, and kind of disambiguate why did it work so well for some groups and not for others, and what was the difference. So I think that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that.
One more question about the exam day. So if you're in person and you have that phase 1, they're allowed to talk with the people around you. Do you have students that want to move? Do they get to like sit with their group? Is it really loud? What is the actual atmosphere in the room like at that time?
It's a circus. It's a total circus, right? So, so you'll have groups that are working together, and I call them runners, but they'll have somebody designated who has a friend in another group that will be like running across the classroom like crazy and having this frantic conversation and running back to their group. So it's a free-for-all. It's a total circus. Like one quarter, a student asked me and said, can I just go to the front of the class and lead a class-wide discussion on this? And I was like, sure, go for it. And ultimately, they didn't do that, but I honestly wouldn't have seen a problem with that. Because again, the idea is that if you're giving them complex problems, it's reasonable that they're going to collaborate in order to solve them, right? Like I think that's what I do as a scientist. That's what I would want my students to learn to do as well. So it's actually really fun to watch. It's a student of mine actually said very grudgingly, he was like, that was kind of fun. And I hate to admit it. But yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stress and tension as well. So I don't want to minimize any of that. But it's a very, it's a very different experience than sort of a traditional quiet, exam. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of energy. It's really fun to watch. And a little part of it is also sad because you'll see some students trying to Google the question. And then they just sit there in front of their computers going, why isn't this on Chegg or whatever it is they're looking at, right? And it's a little sad, but at the same time, they gotta figure it out. Rick, thanks for the comment. I didn't know that Ben Wiggins was doing the same thing. I should probably talk to him and see what his experiences were. But it is really fun because it gets students to really collaborate and I think about the material in a way that they don't normally think about. So
I had one more question, if I may. If I understood you correctly, so you mentioned these groups, they persist even in like discussion sections and maybe labs even. So how do you do that? So here at UW, the discussion section and labs, they're divided into sections, and those are chosen when students register. So usually that's done way before I ever get to meet the students. So how does that work that you can maintain these groups across labs?
When I create the GPA equivalent groups, they're done within each section because I know which section they've signed up for of the class, right? So then section A will have the group, section B will have the groups. And so there's that factor that's taken into consideration. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. That's much more sensible than anything I had imagined.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, since like the students you mentioned are mostly pre-med or on like the STEM track, do you know if the groups that were somewhat successful, did they form groups like outside of your classroom and like in the other classes since they're on a similar track? Did they like
anecdotally, the answer is yes, but I haven't done any formal, like I don't have any formal data on that, right? Like I'll meet them and they'll tell me, oh yeah, like our group is still, we're taking molecular bio the next quarter and we're still sitting in our groups because we work so well together. And some of them have formed, friendships that have lasted for 2 or 3 years and they still like hang out with each other and stuff. And I'll see them, seen them on campus hanging out. So they've also ended up in research labs together because they were like, oh, I'm in this research lab and oh, you should join this research lab. And so there's a lot of some of this informal stuff that also informal benefits that also happen. But again, that's all, purely anecdotal. And obviously I only remember the good stories. So there might have been groups that ended up hating each other at the end of it and just never wanted to have anything to do with them. But yeah, obviously I wouldn't hear those, or if I did, I would forget about them. So. Cool. Oh, and I can stop sharing so we can actually see each other if that's unnecessary. Cool.
Right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I guess, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing this. I think this is a really awesome project, and I'm really excited to think about how I can incorporate similar ideas in my own course.
Yeah, thank you guys. And obviously somebody has my email. So if you need any resources that I can provide you with, just hit me up. I'm happy to send you anything that you need. If you want to incorporate any parts of it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all for hosting and coming to talk and having a great conversation and great questions. Well, hopefully the next time we do this, I will have answers.
Very good.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting.
Awesome. All right. Bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks so much again for your time. Oh. Do you have all the